thanks a lot for the invitation. I hope I'm not exceeding the time too much. And yeah, we tried to put together a kind of overview on the one hand, our studio practice, how we work, but also kind of on a topic which we kind of figured out in the recent years, actually, that follows up since the beginning. So I just share my screen and start the presentation. Yeah. So it will be a little bit, the topic is called making data tangible. And as I mentioned, it's kind of something kind of like a red thread, which is following our practice since the beginning. But before that, actually, it's usually me and Katarina. We both studied together. On the one hand, we did a Bachelor for Product and Furniture Design in Austria, and also partly in Kingston University in London. Then we did a master degree for Conceptual Design in Context, or that was the title at that time, at the Design Academy in Eindhoven. And then we decided that we just try to make our own studio because we thought we have actually nothing to lose. We are used to have no money and no kind of huge responsibilities. So we thought it's probably the best time to give it a try. But then we decided to go back to Vienna because we had the feeling that things are starting. Vienna Design Week was kicking off, and it was like we thought it's nice to be in a surrounding where things are probably starting in a way. And since 2000, so we graduated 2008, and since then, since 2009, we have our studio in Vienna. This is our current studio. Nevertheless, I think what we always have to say, desperation is part of the job. We hope to kind of pass that and kind of always know already in the beginning that after a while, every project reaches the point where you just want to put your head in a box. But now it's also not just me and Katarina anymore. We have a wonderful team. So it's like me, Katarina, then Sophia and Florian, who are permanently with us. And then usually we have like 1 or 2 interns joining the team. And as a studio, we work on a variety of areas, actually. On the one hand, we do objects and furniture design for galleries or companies. Then on the other hand, we're also interested in production processes and its outcome, because we partly think that if you also design already the process, you can also have more freedom to the desired outcome, or the process in itself can be actually already the product in itself and the project. And you can look what's possible when developing processes, like including different influences and so on. Then we also do installations and displays, either in exhibition or shopping windows. Then we do interactive installations and some areas which probably more go into the direction of media art, if you want to categorize things. And also in the recent years, also more like curating and like kind of art direction and leading more or less like a group projects and workshops. And I think what for us, what we defined for us is that design is always a tool for communication, and we think that the designer is very often kind of a mediator. It's always kind of between 2 elements. On the one hand, like between the company and the consumer. On the other hand, let's say if you say it like between the doctor and the patient, or there are always this kind of a designer, in our point of view, is very often kind of in between areas, and it's this kind of mediator and who is pulling the strings together or kind of making connections which are probably were not there in the beginning. And so, and this making data tangible is for us also something, what I said is that we think as a designer, you have also the ability actually to make things understandable, to make complex systems understandable, and to make the people can, or hopefully the people can relate to them in a different way. And so one kind of non-visual example for these numbers. I think we're always confronted, or more and more confronted, like with numbers. And so there's like this 1 million and 1 billion example, for example, and it's very hard to relate to it. And then we came across actually this one comment that 1 million seconds are 1.5 weeks, and 1 billion seconds are actually 32 years. And suddenly this relation between like billion and million becomes much more understandable, and you can relate to it and you see that there's like a huge difference and not just 3 zeros. And I think since then, since this example, we were much more aware what kind of the difference is in a way. But so on the one hand, we as a studio are interested in numbers. And I think one of the projects which deals a lot with numbers was one of our graduation projects, which is called Real Limited. And it's about limited editions which are relating to the limitation in reality and visualizing the limitation within the object. And so we did various objects with it, but it actually all started, the project started with what can a designer do living in an affluent society. I have to say this mind map is like from 2008. So it's like when we did the project. So now it could be probably extended in a much more different way, or you can look at it from different things. But I think it was like looking at us living in Europe, living in an affluent society, looking at what design has done on the one hand, what mass production, for example, all the problems which occurred, what is actually luxury, and especially what is new luxury, which is probably not even tangible, but which is like time, safety, clean air, something which you can't really touch or possess in itself. And so this was kind of all this area which we were looking at, but we couldn't get hold of or grasp it in a proper way until we came actually across this quote from Rolf Fehlbaum. He was at that time still the chairman of Vitra, and he said, limited editions are definitely a product of a time of affluence. This kind of, we were still studying, and there was like a Design Miami, and like these bronze tables were like sold for incredible amounts of money. And then this quote and everything kind of came together, that suddenly if you look at it from the art market, of course, kind of limitation, it becomes valuable, but no one wants to have kind of limitation in reality. So we thought, okay, how can we bring this or relink elements again to reality? And we focused actually on our natural surrounding and this kind of natural limits we have. And of course, this kind of decreasing of the natural surrounding and biodiversity and all kind of these effects of our of our doing, let's put it in that way. And so we created this concept, and this is kind of the concept sketch. So it's the Real Limited concept, and we thought at that time there were kind of 2 brown bears left in Austria, and they were father and son. So the chances of offsprings were practically 0. So we thought, okay, let's take these 2 brown bears, represent them as like big sofas, sell them on the art market. With the money we generate, we try to import bears from Slovenia or Italy or northern Italy, and try to bring them together. Then they could probably repopulate, get offsprings. Then we could create with this amount another sofas or big representation, and by that actually the circle would go from limited to unlimited. And of course, this is a very kind of, we are aware that it's a very naive and idealistic plan, but we thought this kind of using these limited editions actually, or this limitation in reality, to generate actually money as well for environmental funds and so on. But then of course we didn't want to focus on bears, because the WWF is advertising with the panda bear and the ice bear, and everything is kind of cuddly. But there are so many species which are not so visual kind of appealing, but which have kind of the equal importance, even though they're probably small or not so good looking. So we looked at all the kind of red lists in Austria, and talked to biologists about like certain numbers of how many of these species are still existing, and then started the project actually with the glattstielige Stockschwämmchen. And according to biologists of this species, there are around 250 left in Austria. So we casted them we made models out of wax, then we casted them in tin, and then we kind of formed them and showed them still alive on a board, which is basically a preserved rotten wood, because these mushrooms are actually growing on decaying wood. And the second project we did with this night butterfly, or the moth, the Marimba quercus. And according to this one butterfly expert, we talked to there around like 800 to 1,000 left in Austria. So we got like 850 single moth cut out of copper and each individually numbered, and then riveted them together to this kind of wall lights that the moth are again like flying towards the light. And since then, actually, we continued to work on different species of moth in different materials and in different installations, and every time actually one of these objects is sold, like 10% of the selling price is going to an environmental fund, which is actually then buying land in Austria to just prevent it of being built on and so on. And so we think this is actually we thought this is probably the most appropriate way that land is actually kind of bought by organizations. But also here, I think it's like, if you talk about highly endangered species, for example, a moth, one of the moth species, it says around 1,200. And 1,200 is again, so you have like, is this 1,200, or are these already 1,200, or is this 1,200? Like, what's the relation to it, and how can you visualize it, and how can you actually then also get a relation to it? Actually, the first one was 1,200 dots, but we got the opportunity to do an exhibition in the Kunsthaus in Vienna. It's a small museum, and then we visualized actually the whole population which is left in this case from the Cuculia tanacetti. It's a moth species just living in like now just living in one part of Austria. And this is actually the whole population which is left in Austria. And if you see this suddenly, like 1,200 become frighteningly little, actually, if you look at it. Or suddenly you have a relation what it means and how many or how little they are. And so we think that actually if you visualize it in a different way, it often results also in an emotional connection, because you look at it from a different perspective. But nevertheless, what's for us important is from a design perspective, that we are also guiding the thoughts of the visitors or of the person who is looking at it. So I mean, when it is exhibited, let's say at the fair or at the exhibition, it's often like, oh, what a nice butterfly lamp. And then the visitors go closer, and then if they see the shape, then they maybe they're not butterflies, maybe they're moth, and then okay, and why are they actually numbered? And then on the lamp fitting, or if someone suddenly the communication starts and about this numbering, you can talk about endangered species and the loss of biodiversity, and also on the lamp fitting itself, it says like how many species of this one moth are still included in this one lamp. And so then we also continued like with limited grasses table, or where we also talked to a biologist. She's in Vienna, and she is now updating the red list, or the book of red lists in Austria. And from this one grass species, there are actually just 200 single grasses left in whole Austria. And so in a way we can make 5 tables, and each of them has like this kind of 40 grasses in it, or this limited fern, because this fern is growing kind of in this one area because of the certain rocks and stones that are there. And so we make kind of these small porcelain vases with these copies or these duplications of the rocks. But I mean, it's not just numbers which interest us to make data, or data is not just numbers. I think it's also materials and the origin of materials. And if you think about like fabric or metal, if you close your eyes and you think about it, most probably you think of kind of this big bulk of fabric, or like this half raw materials like tubes and rods you buy in the DIY store. But actually we should think of this herd of sheep where the wool is coming from, or kind of this mine where the iron is sourced and excavated. And this kind of connection to the origin where things are coming from was the starting point of the project, which is called Knowledge Tools Memory, which we did in 2013. I think it was more it was a self-initiated project, because we had the feeling we have to just build it and visualize it as well. And it was also at the time where 3D printing was kind of this big hype. Whatever you looked up, any blog or magazine, everything is like 3D printing is the future. Everyone will print everything at home. Everyone will be his or her own producer, and so on. And then if you think about it, we had already this part where everyone made everything at home, and there was just a complete timing and setting. And we thought this kind of making it on your own, you also think where the things are coming from, or know where the things are coming from. And this kind of relation, we think, is got partly a little bit lost. So we made this blanket. It is a woolen blanket, and on the blanket, all the decoration is actually showing how to reproduce the blanket from scratch. And you get with it kind of the small basic tools that gives you the possibility to actually reproduce the blanket by yourself. And we also made the same thing with paper, where we sourced like all the raw materials from the city in Vienna and tried to make, like with these basic tools, a sheet of paper. And in the end, the whole set came like with this sieve, and where you can boil it, and also this sketchbook was kind of this book with the instructions how to make it. And I think especially when we made the paper, it was really to understand that we got so kind of disconnected a little bit, and that we take materials and the sources so much for granted that we don't even think about it, like what effort it is or what technology is behind. And I mean, this is, I said, this kind of example from the paper in the studio, but it was not even like a paper. It was just like a visualization of a paper, which was hardly useful. But and if you compare it to white paper, suddenly this white paper becomes really a high-tech piece, actually. And this relates also a little bit kind of this, that we to this pyramid of technology by Next Nature Network. And they visualized actually, okay, that every invention was first kind of envisioned, then it was kind of operational, then it was applied, then it was accepted, then it got vital actually in the whole society, until it becomes invisible, and on top of it, it becomes then naturalized, that we don't even think about it. Like, for example, controlled fire or the clock. It's not something that we look at it anymore as an invention, but that it becomes more like so surrounded that we don't even question it anymore. And it's the same, of course, like with paper, and also if you looked at all the other elements like the light bulb and the electricity, everything kind of climbs up the ladder. And we found it an interesting aspect of how actually this kind of disconnection is slowly growing in our everyday life, which is, of course, not that we have to think for everything at every stage where it's coming from, but we think it's an interesting aspect of it. And with this kind of relationship of raw material to the final metal in this case, we also continue the project because we were invited to for a residency project in Ljubljana from the Museum for Design and Architecture, and they had this craft project which was called Made In, and there we had the chance to collaborate with Benno Ogrin. He's a stonemason, and I think what was for us interesting in the end, or like not for us yeah, it's like that all these elements you see now on the screen, they're actually all connected. The screws, the cup, and all these elements were actually, there used to be a stone at one point. And for us, the interesting part of this project was actually that during the research we met Miloš Babec. He was he's the director of the Geological Institute of Slovenia, and we had a meeting with him, and it was the first time that we thought actually that geology is super interesting and poetic, because it was like 1.5 hours kind of he explained us his way of looking at the world and geology, so this was kind of the starting point that we thought it's interesting to look again at stones and excavation, because one of his main topic was like everything that we cannot grow we have to mine, and for us kind of made this kind of change of looking at things as well. And so we looked actually at all the map and all the mines which were, and all the materials which were kind of mined and excavated in Slovenia, and then thought it would be interesting to combine it actually with the stonemason. And in the end, we researched these ores, and we wanted to show this relation between the raw material and the resulting metal in the end. So we decided for 4 ores. The one was kind of aluminium, then copper, iron, and zinc, and those were all the elements which were kind of mined in Slovenia. And so by that, actually all these kind of datas, or these relations between raw material and the metal, were actually defining the design of the object, of the final collection we made with the stonemason. And this was the collection. So we had several kind of stools or small tables, and the mirror and the bench, and always the stone base has always kind of the same size. And then it always shows the ratio in metal, and the metal element, or the second part of the element, is actually the metal you would get out if you would process this amount of ore. So with zinc, it was like 0.8%. And suddenly also here you see what 0.8% actually is, that it's hardly anything. Or with copper, it's like 2.2%. Iron is like 16.5%. And then we also used brass, because it's like, of course, copper and zinc. And additionally to the project, we wanted to show this more like thought books with all the kind of this, yeah, what we found inspiring from Miloš, from the Geological Institute, kind of these words he said, or these sentences. And one is that nothing is ever lost, and we thought this is also a very interesting or nice way to look at it, so that the mass of the earth is actually more or less constant, but that it's always kind of a relocation of elements. You take it somewhere, bring it to another place, and then in the end it becomes actually again like part of it. And those, I mean, these books are more like, we thought, more like thought processes. It's not so much about just like bringing data or just a scientific information. I think also to bring it more kind of looking at it partly also a bit of a philosophical or just visual elements. And the same like with this used to be a stone, that it's, if you look at it, what everything we have in our hands or what we are surrounded, so many things used to be a stone really at one point. And and then the other thing he also mentioned is there is no small mine. And this is more about kind of the acceleration actually of mining, of course, the change of pace because of tools, technology, and that now kind of the biggest mine in Brazil, the biggest iron mine, is mining like 247,000 tons per day. And this kind of yeah, huge numbers and huge dimensions. And we were hoping that by bringing the relation actually to something like a small metal element, that everyone who looks at the project looks at kind of small scrap metals or something differently, that it's not just a can they throw away or a small screw, but that it's actually a big rock which was sourced somewhere on a different part of the world, transformed actually the landscape and was processed, and then it's kind of just this small screw which is left. But to have again probably a relation to dimension and weight of it. But yeah, as said, data is not just numbers as well as materials, but it's also labor. And we got the possibility actually to, we were invited by Nodus Rugs. It's an Italian company who is working with different rug craftsmen all over the world to develop a rug. And when we met Andrea actually the first time, we talked about like hand knotted rugs, and then we asked him how long it takes, and he said, yeah, depending on the kind of amount of knots per square centimeter and so on, it can be that the rug takes up to 6 months of knotting time. And we were completely yeah, overwhelmed, I think, because we didn't imagine that it takes so long. And then we thought, okay, if we as kind of the designer have no idea how long things take to produce, how actually consumer or other people who are not so much interested in production processes should know about it. And so the goal was actually to bring this kind of information into the object. And so what we designed for the rug was actually this kind of outline and a basic grid for the weavers. In this case, they were produced in Nepal. And so they got actually this outline, and then they have this kind of grid color, and then every day they get a pair of colors and start knotting actually line by line, and the next day they get another pair of colors. And by that actually, so you see the first day, then the second day, the third, and so on. And every kind of knotting day is represented by one colorful line, which is kind of filling up this rug. And in the end, from the final rug, you can actually count and understand like all these kind of labor days, and each stripe represents 1 day of production. And so, and by that, so with the company, we did like 2 different sizes. One was a smaller one, which is made by one weaver, and the other one, a bigger one, which is made by 2 weavers, which are working next to each other. And then each actually rug, here you see the 2 weavers working on a bigger rug. And in the end, for example, the big rug was taking the 2 craftsmen 48 days to work on, and the smaller one 26 days. And each each rug actually gets on the front side a label with the name of the person, and when they started to produce the rug and when they ended it. And what was interesting was when the presentation was in Milan, suddenly a person came to us and say, do they need to work faster now? Because you see how much they manage on one day. And then we were kind of a bit puzzled and very much worried, because it was exactly the opposite of the intention what we wanted to do. And so we went to Andrea, kind of the head of the company, and asked him, do they have to work fast? And he said, no, no, don't worry. They all know how fast they are working, and they always pair them differently. But I think what was more interesting, because you could ask the same question for any rug you see, or for any rug you could have seen in the exhibition. But as soon as you actually make this information visible, then suddenly people start making these questions. And so I think this was for us a very interesting experience, because we didn't thought about actually that this question would arise. And I think it was also for us very interesting to see that with object actually and with design, you can make people asking probably different questions. And the last thing that we are also interesting as a studios and also kind of creating experiences to communicate different stories or communicate different topics. And the last project actually we did is was now shown in it was made for Perrier Souchette. It's a French champagne brand, and it was a interactive installation, and it was shown now at Design Miami. And this is basically the project.
I hope Thomas is still there. Well, people, hang in there for 1 second. I think he will jump back in. I'm very sure he will come back. Otherwise, I will give the word to one of the students to continue this presentation. I think the video got stuck and something happened, that's for sure, but let's wait a second. Haven't had this before with an online presentation, so. No reason for panic. We can just hang out in the digital space for a minute longer. There you are. You're muted, but
Oops, sorry.
Yeah. It was a small glitch, but
yeah, it was okay. Sorry, I just continue as if nothing would have happened. Yes. Okay, so basically for the project we wanted to focus on kind of this equality of species, that we tried to kind of break up this kind of hierarchy of species, and therefore we represented more than 100 or 102 species, including the human, in this metal mesh species. And as a visitor, you actually don't see yourself, but you're represented as groups of these species, and by that actually hopefully showing that we are nothing, and we are so not nothing. That's the wrong starting point. That we are so much entangled actually with our natural surrounding that we probably don't even know and probably don't understand. That we are very much kind of depending on it as well. But I come a little bit more to the research later on. So this was the installation, which was based on kind of this huge shelf, like a cabinet of curiosity, but in the center it kind of was disappearing more or less, and you see yourself in the mirror. And here the whole project was based on kind of research of interconnections and symbiosis. And so for that, actually, we researched 9 different clusters from all over the world, which were then, they always had like one species as a starting point. And from that on, kind of we researched all these connections and these kind of networks. Of course, it is just like a glimpse of it and a part of it, and all these elements, which are actually the starting points of these clusters, they are all related to us humans. On the one hand, there is like, for example, there's the potato, then there is a moss from wetlands in Congo, then there is like from the Great Barrier Reef, a coral, then there's the sea lettuce from close to Japan, and the earthworm, the saguaro cactus, and so on. So like all these elements covering dependencies from us, like clean air, clean water, barrier, and food, of course. And so, I mean, now it's not, but so all this, for us, it was important to show, as I mentioned, all of them in the same scale. So no matter what kind of part of the biodiversity they are. And so we choose species from kind of this visual biodiversity, so everything which is kind of above the ground, then also soil bacteria and soil animals, and up to kind of small microbes and bacteria. And we think they all actually have the equal importance. And so they're all represented in pretty much the same scale. And so for this project, you can, I mean, now on the, this is kind of the information where each species is actually described about the size of it, or the real size of it, where it is, then also the relation to its surrounding flora and fauna in this area where they're actually usually living, and also the relation to human. And so they are different on all these kind of 9 clusters. Yeah, you can actually dive into and get more information of it. And yes, and then and for all these species, they were all made out of metal mesh. And I think here you see more that there was on the one hand this kind of research part where we researched of kind of all these connections, and also the connections to human, and these interdependencies in a way. And then, of course, there was kind of this artistic interpretations, so that we had to build all these species. This in total, it was like 102 different species. And then they were shown in the room, where there were like 16 small loudspeakers. So if you walk around the room, you see kind of different, or you hear different sounds. And you also see kind of your own representation. And this is a little bit like of the making of. So we made first all these pieces as paper models. Then all these models were digitalized. Then all these cutting files were actually made digital, then arranged. And then everything was cut in a kind of a small metal mesh, which is a kind of a stretch metal element, which was then, like the paper models, actually folded and sewed together. And afterwards they were all kind of painted like with airbrush by hand. Then we had like all these kind of three-dimensional species, and these were then all kind of singularly photographed. Then of course our carpenter Jacqueline, she made the whole shelf. And then all these species were photographed, then cut out again in Photoshop, animated partly. And then the digital team were actually developing the 3D tracking and this kind of real-time animation that every human or every visitor is actually then represented by this species, always from one of the clusters. And yeah, I think, I mean, as you see in the credits, it's really a group effort, and I think this was just possible because we had so many great people collaborating on this project with us, to developing all the cutting files, making them, developing all the technological part as well. And just the last part, I think, is this kind of educational and how to communicate actually things. And we got the opportunity to co-create with Janina Falkner and Marlies Wirth from the MAC Design Lab, and it was in 2019. And it was it's basically a big part of the basement of the MAC, around 2,000 square meters, and we arranged them all like as chapters we thought interesting for nowadays, which are not based on typologies of objects or material or whatsoever, but more around like topics like shaping also the digital world, the input output, which sharing work, or also the cabinet of consequences, design dilemma, and so on. So like all these elements, and which were then over 500 pieces, like from art, design, and architecture, were then mixed together to visualize the these topics. And also here, I mean, there's like on the homepage, you see a lot about the project. But just to conclude a little bit about this making data tangible element, I think it's there's one. This is the vitrine of the iPhone display, which were like all the objects of the collection of the Mac on the left-hand side, which are all following functions which are now included in the smartphone. And it's not saying that these objects and the things are obsolete, but they are kind of new design elements following, of course, like two-dimensional and digital elements, which need a lot of design as well. But I think what's now for us interesting as well is, on the one hand, I think we are interested in bringing facts and data into reality and to visualize them in tangible objects. But I think it's also now what interests us as well is like connecting again reality to digital data to show that it takes actually real resources for an intangible world to exist, which is something which is intangible, and to connect it again, I think it's also something which interests us at the moment. Okay, this was it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I think maybe we can do a digital applause, although everybody's muted. Thanks so much, Thomas. Although the little online digital glitch, I think it's really interesting to see your practice, but also see how it's evolved. So it was really nice to see you start at the beginning and that you see the sense of data and responding or realigning with reality is kind of also not even maturing in the work, but also how you evolve as studio. And I think that's very nice to see and how you develop that. I'm gonna look at these 72 people, students. If anyone has a question, feel free to unmute or feel free to drop it in the chat if you want to. Mirte raised a hand. You can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I have a question. I wrote it down, so I'm going to read it. Do you approach the project in a way of, I want to tell this story and this is how we're going to do it? Or does it start with a question and then you begin researching and then you find out what the story has to be?
I think it mainly, I think it was more with the question or the interest of a field. And I think it also depends, for example, for the commissioned project, for example, the last one for Perrier-Jouët, there's of course also the dialogue with the commissioning partner. But I have to say, usually, or we are in a very lucky position to get a lot of freedom. So like we get topics like the last one for Perrier-Jouët was biodiversity. And then we could actually choose our own path and our own interest, what also interests us a little bit at the moment, or what we think is also for us probably partly a new area where we didn't look into it so much. And I think there it kind of evolves, and so there is not, it's hard to answer. I think it's always different from project to project. For example, with Ratio, it was really this dialogue with the Geological Institute, with Milos, who suddenly focused our interest again in ore and materials, where they are coming from. And without actually him talking so passionate and poetic about geology, we wouldn't have followed this path. So I think it's hard to say, but I think afterwards, I think it's more this tricky part to condense it again and make maybe that it seems afterwards as one statement or one question or one short message as a starting point, also for the visitors to have like one element to hook on, and then giving them the possibility to dive deeper. For example, with all the species, which were then also shown next to the installation, where the people could click on it and learn more about the species and dive into. And I mean, now it's digital on a website, but still to have like this experience part in a way, but then giving the second layer where we can also share the research. I don't know if it really answered your question, but it's really different from topic to topic, from project to project.
It's really clear, thank you.
And Thomas, I think what is interesting also that you say, sometimes you get a very open framework. It's a very open context. And I think our students also deal with that. You get a briefing or you're graduating. How do I frame my plan? And do you have any tips on that? What you would, I mean, because you already mature in your practice, so you know what your interest is. Often when you're in beginnings can be quite tricky sometimes. How do you find your first handles when the briefing is very open?
It's I have to say, I mean, we are in a very lucky position that we were always at least two. So
partnership help in that
for us. Yes, for us both. And I think it's important to have kind of these dialogues about the topic, and also then by these dialogues or also discussions like within the studio to point out all directions it could actually go. And then actually we partly also prove if we have rough directions, we partly take the time and think already in the a little bit early probably of kind of small ideas we would have in this direction. And then suddenly we could define that some directions are probably very interesting from a from a reading or that we're very curious about to learn more, but probably don't spark so much kind of imagination or ideas how to communicate it. While other topics, then suddenly it's like everything is kind of sparkling and spilling ideas, and it goes from one to another, and then it narrows down already a little bit some directions. Yeah. But I mean, this is how we sometimes do it.
I think what you say, having that sense of like peer-to-peer, having that sense that you sit down and you cannot kind of underestimate the impact of brainstorming, of sitting down with someone and messing about on the subject. And I think that's important. And anyway,
we go often for walks, but that's
someone else? Don't hold back, people. It's a digital space. Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, I also kind of you working on Hermes before in Tokyo, I guess. Yes. But I just wondering, is it also kind of working with the similar way when you're working on something like big company or client, something like that?
I think yes, because the briefings are very similar, I have to say. The briefings are very open, and you get I mean, I think for every project that, for example, for Hermes, the project was playful. And so it gave us a lot of kind of freedom to research. And then you also have, of course, kind of the restriction of the space. So there, it's a shopping window. And so you have already on that kind of certain restrictions, what's possible, what's not, what can be used and what not. But on the other hand, for example, shopping window is also a very interesting aspect because it's like a theater, but just a commercial theater, because you have like the audience on one side looking at this one window. So yes, the way of working is actually pretty much the same. It also starts like which story you would like to communicate, or which topic. And then working around the restrictions of either if it's the space or the size of the space, the budget, or the producibility, and so on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Feel free to unmute. I see Marcel raising his hand.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
When do you know a work is good? And how do you decide that?
Good question in design, I think.
I have to say we are very nervous all the time when a work is finished, because at one point you have to say, okay, that's it, you go for it, and then also time is running out. And then usually more when it's presented, and then you see the reaction of people. So especially for the installative works, I think then we can definitely say it. And then you can judge it differently. But I think you want to know more. I guess the question was more, when do you make a decision within the studio to say, okay, that's now good or not?
Well, I was also thinking of your work obviously needs to communicate with your audiences, and every time you have a different approach, still there is this a little bit of educational element in your work. So I was wondering if it reaches your audience, are you satisfied then, or do you also want to have a more provocative approach in which you start the dialogue with your audience?
I think, I mean, for us, it's important that I think it's understandable also for a big variety of visitor, that it's not just targeted on like one specific group. And I think, I mean, it's obviously also depending on project to project, but I think what's, for example, for this installative or interactive project, I think there are two things which are very nice. I think the one is the first reaction of the visitors in the first half a second is something very honest, because you can't, you don't have the time to question everything and so on. So I think it's a very honest reaction, and I think this is something which shows you actually how people feel about it, because it's a more emotional reaction. And I think then it's interesting, especially in kind of this exhibition places where I also have the possibility to be on site for a long time, to then really be there, watch people, and if people, if you see they're more interested, to offer if they have any questions. And I think then suddenly dialogues starts, and I think this is always very, also for us very interesting, because you see different reactions, different points of views, different approaches towards the same topic, and I think this is then very rewarding in a way. I think this is the this is always a very nice part of the project, of course. But
thanks. Patricia, I see you raise your hand. You can unmute.
Yeah, hello. I have a question. It's more maybe personal, I would say, but it's about how do we avoid getting stuck? Because, well, of course, when you are a team of designers, getting stuck, it's not so hard, because then you have other people to help you with finding out solutions. But when you are a student, you have to do your work by yourself. And sometimes getting stuck is a big problem. How maybe not how we solve that, because that's a huge question, but what are the first steps for this?
I think getting stuck is also something very beautiful. Not beautiful, it's very frustrating, but I think it's very nice if you realize that you get stuck, because I think it's important to get stuck. But I think to avoid, or not avoid, for us it's partly, how should I say, or what we often say also to students, if you see that if you have once a project, and I think you're always very in danger to have kind of this tunnel focus, and that you just see like this one direction. But I think it's also important to make a drawing, to kind of execute it in a visual way, that you get it out of your system, and then you always have it there as a plan B, and then you can push yourself to think of a different direction, because it's once already existing in a way, because it's out of your head, it's on paper, it's kind of visualized, written down, but it's still not set in stone. But then it's sometimes easier, I think, to move on and look at a different way. And I think the other thing, what we once, it was just a small exercise, I think, at university, but it was to have a kind of a grid to write down like topics or starting points or directions, and on the other half, like an Excel sheet. On the one hand, you have like topics and directions, and on the other hand, you have outcomes. Let's say, I don't know, object installation, public space, and so on. And by that, you actually have a grid of, let's say, suddenly you have 15 combinations, and then to sit down and try to fill all kind of these combinations. And by that, I think, yeah, I don't know, for us, it sometimes helps to force yourself to think of a combination and just also think of an outcome or think of a direction, to see that there are different possibilities than the one which is where you're stuck. And I think this partly helped us, like, apart from talking to other people. Yeah.
What I like what you said, Tom, is also that when you stuck, you can see this thing as there's something like stuckness, and stuckness is a positive. You can see stuckness as a positive attitude of growth. You know, you need sometimes the friction to grow through this process, but it also talks a bit about the sense that an idea is not a static product. It's not a static form. An idea is a process that is a process. So in this it's a bit like when you see that process, it's like, it's not that you get a clear idea and then you go for it, but by doing it, by forcing yourself to do little exercises and getting it out of your head, things can kind of evolve. So stuckness is...
I also don't believe in linear evolution of you have the starting point of a project, and then step by step it comes to I think it's always like a loop or something that you work, and then you think, it leads to something, and then it's
I think we agree.
Throws you back again, and
we always say there's not an A to Z process. You don't follow the ABC. It's about finding the stuff in the messy bits also, but. So Patricia, messy bits are sometimes a good thing, you know, you can find good things in that.
But it's still horrible to be stuck.
Yeah, thank